Welcome back to Outside Views, and look at the state of the world today and you will see a recurring theme of countries trying to run away from the very things that made them prosperous in the first place. It's January 2026 and we are standing at a crossroads where the ghosts of the past are being invited back into the halls of power in Washington. Just weeks after taking office nearly a year ago, Donald Trump pulled the tariff blunderbuss from the shed and fired it haphazardly in every direction. He didn't waste any time proving that his version of liberation involves building walls of taxes around the American consumer. And even though the financial markets tried to push back against the maximal protectionism of what he calls Liberation Day, the reality on the ground is stark. And the average tariff rate on United States goods and the imports today is a multiple of what it was at the start of 24. We haven't seen import duties this high since the 1920s. And if you know your history, you know that that episode did not end well for anyone. And it may seem far-fetched to some to compare today's landscape with the run-up to the Great Depression, but the parallels are screaming at us. And we are supposed to have learned how to avoid such deep economic ruptures, but it seems we are choosing to ignore those lessons in favor of a rose-tinted nostalgia. And I find it baffling that anyone could look at the United States today, a country where prosperity from Washington state to DC has never been higher by standard macro indicators, and think the solution is to break the system. Yet this nostalgia for the past that never really existed appears to outshine reasons at every turn. And this is exactly where the lesson of Brexit becomes a raised finger for warning for the American administration. And why this video, with so much United States in the beginning, is happening on this channel. In 2026, we are marking the 10th anniversary of the UK referendum on leaving the European Union, and it's a truly sobering milestone. 10 years ago, the British public was sold a dream of Singapore on Thames and a radical retreat from the largest trading partner on the doorstep. And most economists were deeply pessimistic, asking how severing the umbilical cord to your primary market could possibly end well. At first, the Brexiteers laughed because the apocalyptic forecasts of an immediate crash didn't happen. London remained a financial center, and the pandemic masked a lot of the structural rot that was beginning to set in. But today, the recent studies from places like LBBW Research and Yale show a much darker picture. The damage from stepping away from a free trade regime wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing leak. And Britain's economy today appears to be 6 to 8% smaller than it would have been without that fateful decision to leave. The initial projections weren't wrong. They were just more patient than the pundits expected. The key brake on the British economy has been weak investment because of uncertainty, which is the silent killer of growth. And when firms don't know what the trade rules will be next month, they don't build factories and they don't hire at scale. And this uncertainty lowered British productivity by at least 4% and has ultimately diminished the living standards of British citizens compared to their neighbors in the EU. And now, look back at the United States under this current administration's protectionist fever. America's economy has held up better so far than many expected, much like the UK in the first year or the 2 first years after the vote. Inflation didn't surge as instantly as feared in the immediate wake of Liberation Day, and growth stayed near 2%. But if we learn anything from Brexit, it's that deferred is not forgiven. I expect the US will feel the effects of its partial exit from the world economy with a lag that will test the patience of every forecaster. The uncertainty over future tariff parameters and the cost basis of firms is already deterring massive amounts of investment there. Think about the AI revolution. Without sustained capital expenditure into data centers, the broader US investment growth simply stalls. And we are already seeing the signs of this economic skid mark appearing in the data for 2026. And they didn't even count in the new threatened tariffs with regard to Greenland. As in Britain, this will gradually weigh on productivity, it will weigh on growth, and it will keep inflation higher for longer. And LBBW research is currently projecting US growth in 2026 to be just 1.5%, which is significantly lower than the market consensus of 2.1%. And even worse, they are seeing inflation expectations for the US at 3.5%, while the markets are still dreaming of 2.8%. The policy uncertainty around trade will remain elevated throughout 2026 as the administration keeps twisting the tariff screws. The parallels to post-Brexit Britain are, to put it mildly, not encouraging at all for the American worker. The tariff blunderbuss might look like a weapon of strength, but it's actually a sign of fundamental weakness. America's share of global trade is falling, dropping down toward 13%, even as 70% of the world continues to trade under WTO rules. And while Washington plays a pure power play, the rest of the world is moving on and striking deals with the EU and its single market of 450 million people. Don't forget Mercosur has just been signed. And countries from India to Australia are eager to find rule-based trade partners, while the US isolates itself behind a wall of duties. And I believe that the Trump liberation will eventually be seen as the moment the US decided to follow the UK into a self-imposed economic twilight. You cannot tax your way to prosperity, and you certainly cannot make a country great by making it more expensive for your own citizens to buy the things they need. Although it's hilarious to see, especially on TikTok, where I see most of that, where to see how many Americans do not understand tariffs and who is paying those tariffs. If tariffs are put on imports, in the end, usually the consumer pays this tariff, not the country the imports are coming from. The Americans will pay those tariffs. And if they tariff the foreign imports that high that American goods will be cheaper than the foreign ones, it will still be much more expensive to buy any of these than it was before they introduced those tariffs. And that means that in the wallet of the average American, they will feel that. The price level from these 2025 tariffs has already risen by more than 1%, which is the equivalent of a $1,800 loss for the average household. And for those at the bottom of the income distribution, the loss is even more devastating relative to their earnings. We are seeing price increases of 30 to 40% in sectors like apparel, leather, and textiles already. Food prices are rising, and the cost of a new motor vehicle has jumped by thousands of dollars. And this isn't a theory anymore. It's the reality of the 2026 American economy. And just like the British Brexiteers who promised that everything would be easy, the current administration shrugs off these insights. They are convinced that protectionism is a magic wand, but economics has a way of asserting itself eventually. The deferred damage is coming for the US, just as it came for the UK. And if you stop investing in your own future because you're too busy fighting trade wars, your productivity will wither. And if you alienate your allies and force them to look for other partners, you lose your seat at the head of the global table. I mean, even before the whole Greenland shenanigans, we saw the deal between Canada and China. Canada turned its back on the United States. The United States once was the benevolent hegemon of a rules-based order, but today it acts like a gambler who thinks he can ignore the odds. And I find it deeply tragic that we have a perfect case study in the UK of why this doesn't work. Yet the US is following the same script page by page. The 10-year anniversary of the Brexit vote should be a day of mourning for lost opportunities and not a blueprint for American policy. But here we are, watching the same mistakes being repeated with even more arrogance. The whack-a-mole game of trade policy is leaving businesses exhausted and consumers broke. We see the administration hailing historic deals every week, but these deals are often built on empty promises that never materialize. And the US-EU deal from last year has been put on hold by the EU Parliament because of what's happening right now. So much about 60 deals in 60 days. And when the president eventually figures out that these deals aren't bringing back the 1950s, he will only harden his stance on tariffs. And this capricious policy makes reliable planning exceptionally hard. And that is the sword of Damocles hanging over the 2026 economy. And I believe that the waters in 2026 are going to become much choppier as the lag finally catches up with the US consumer. And I'm only talking about the last tariffs. The stock markets might be priced for perfection right now, but they aren't accounting for the systemic rot that protectionism creates. The Federal Reserve is being pushed into a corner, with Trump attempting to politicize the very institution that keeps the dollar stable. And if the independence of the Fed is eroded, then the last safeguard against irresponsible policy is gone. We are watching the Little Britain effect across the Atlantic to create a little America. And it's a choice for decline disguised as a choice for strength. And in the end, you cannot escape the reality that trade is a two-way street. If you block the world from your door, you eventually find that you are the one who is trapped inside. And the raised finger of warning from Brexit is pointed directly at Washington. But it seems nobody there is looking. They are too busy looking at the rose-tinted rear-view mirror to see the cliff they are driving toward. And I'm convinced that by the end of 2026, the American public will be feeling the same regret that has taken over the UK. And the cost of this nostalgia is simply too high for any modern economy to bear. We should be building bridges and data centers and not tariffs and walls. The lessons are all there, written in the stagnant GDP of the United Kingdom and the empty promises of the last 10 years. And it's time to put the blunderbuss away and start dealing with the world as it actually is. Reality is a harsh teacher, and the tuition fees for this particular lesson are going to be very, very expensive. We are watching a superpower choose to become a middle power, all in the name of a greatness that lived only in the imagination of its leaders. It's a tragedy in 3 acts, and we are currently in the middle of the second. I only hope that the third act doesn't involve the same Great Depression that followed the last time they tried this. But as of today, the path they are on leads nowhere but down. And now Trump even doubled down on Greenland. And if he comes up with his tariffs because the allies of Denmark are standing firmly on the side of Denmark with regard to defending Greenland, if he doubles down on these tariffs, if he makes that come true, there is what Emmanuel Macron proposed, still the trade bazooka the EU can pull. And you don't even want to know what that would mean. Then you can say goodbye to the worth of the dollar.